All right, sake 101. So, sake in relation to other drinks. Sake is like wine and beer because it is a fermented beverage. It's not a distilled beverage like spirits are, but the production is a little bit different than both wine and beer. It's similar to beer because rice doesn't have readily available sugars. So we have to convert the starch inside of the rice grain into sugar before we can begin fermentation. So, kind of similar to beer production in that way. And then once the sugar is ready available, then the fermentation is going to be kind of similar to wine fermentation. However, sake is unique in quite a few different steps, but there's two really big steps that make sake so completely different than any other alcoholic beverage or just beverage in the world. So, the basics. We pretend we are Canadian when we say sake. It is sake, not sake. And sake in general is going to be between about 15 to 17% alcohol. It is the highest naturally occurring alcohol content of any fermented beverage, which is crazy. They have a specific yeast that is alcohol tolerant to be able to get these alcohol levels naturally to 15 to 17, even up to 20, 22% alcohol, all completely done naturally. There's no fortification or anything along those lines. Sake is predominantly produced in Japan, but legally it can be produced anywhere in the world. And almost every major country in the world actually produces sake. We just don't really hear about them very often. The majority of the ones we hear from are here in the US, and then, of course, coming from Japan. Sake is made from four main ingredients. So I'm going to basically lay out all of the ingredients, the steps that we have to do to get these ingredients ready, and then we will talk about how sake is actually made. So we're going to start with rice. Rice is our first main ingredient, and it is the base ingredient for the production. We have to make sake with rice. That is given by law that it has to be made from rice. We can't use any other agricultural product to make sake. So once the rice is harvested, we have to actually prepare the rice first. So you'll see as we go through this, there are a lot of steps to be able to get sake to be what it is. The rice preparation is the first step. So once the rice is harvested, you can see in this picture here, there is a hard husk on the outside of the rice grain itself. So we need to polish the rice grain to remove that husk. Then we will wash the rice, soak the rice, and steam the rice. So breaking into each of these steps, the polishing step is extremely important. The husk is the outer portion right here, the very dark exterior shell. And this portion has to be removed to be able to access the grain inside. This shell is a natural protective layer for the rice against anything externally, whether it be climate, weather issues, hazards, birds, pests, things along those lines. The next layer is a brown layer, which is called the bran. If the bran remains on the rice, this is considered brown rice. However, most sake is not made with brown rice. I would say maybe only 1% of sake could be made with brown rice. It's extremely rare and not something that you'll see very often. So typically, the bran is going to be removed. The bran has a lot of nutrients and a lot of flavor, which is perfect for table rice for eating. We want our rice to have nice flavor. But for sake, the flavor of bran is not preferred. So it is typically going to be polished away. The next layer, so once we remove these two layers, there's about 92% of the rice grain itself remaining. The next layer is the white interior layer. This is known as the endosperm, which has a lot of nutrients for yeast as well as flavors. So the more we polish this layer down, the less flavor the sake is going to have. The lighter, the more delicate the texture of the sake will be. The internal layer, this is known as the shinpaku, which is the starchy center. Now, there's two different types of rice. There's table rice and there is sake specific rice. I'm not going to speak about table rice because it's pretty rare for a producer to use table rice to make sake. There's about 100, a little over 100 different sake specific rice varieties. And we'll talk about those more in Sake 201 as well as the rice breakout class. We will really dive into rice for that one. So what's special about sake specific rice is this starchy center right here. A regular grain of table rice does not have this very well defined starchy center. When you polish sake specific rice, you can actually see this starchy center. It will be an opaque white center that is within the rice grain itself. So depending on how much we polished away the outside of the rice grain, we can use specific names on the label of the sake bottle itself. So if we polish away 30% of the exterior layers, meaning 70% of the grain is remaining, the brewer has the option to label their sake hanjozo. This indicates that 30% has been milled away, 70% of the rice grain is remaining. Next is if 60% is remaining, we can use the word genjo on the label. And if 50% or less is remaining, we can use the word daigenjo on the label. Now these are maximum remaining. You could have a hanjozo that is milled to 45%. You could have a daigenjo that's milled to 8% if you want to. These are just the maximums that are required of the rice grain remaining for these specific names. Again, the core, again, is called the shinpaku. It is where all of the starch lies in the rice grain, or the majority of the starch lies in the rice grain, and the most important part of the rice grain for sake production. So when we polish the rice grain, there's this huge machine that has these spinning whetstones inside of the machine. And this spinning whetstones will be spinning very, very close to each other. The rice grains will fall down through the spinning whetstones. And basically every time it hits the whetstone, a nick will happen to the rice and a little bit of that rice grain will get nicked away. This is going to happen over the course of at very least 12 hours to get to hanjozo. It could take up to a couple days to get to a daigenjo level. And the rice will just keep funneling through from the bottom back up to the top, back into the spinning whetstone wheels to keep having a little bit nicked off every single time to get to the percentage remaining that the brewer so desires for that specific grain of sake. Next, we need to wash the rice. So once we've milled away the exterior layers, there will be a fine powder that is on the rice grains, which is basically residue from milling away the rice grains. What happens is if we leave that fine powder, we basically are doing ourselves the disservice of going through the polishing method because all of those flavors are within the powder. So we want to wash the rice to get the flavor off of the rice grain, the powder itself off of the rice grain. And then we are going to soak the grain. The purpose of soaking the rice grain is to start to have the grain absorb water to be able to make the grain itself malleable so we can access the starchy center. Timing is really crucial on how long we soak the rice for. A daigenjo specified rice grain might be soaked for just a couple minutes and timed to the specific second, where a hanjozo rice grain might spend overnight or a few hours soaking up the rice. The more we mill the rice down or polish the rice down, the quicker it will absorb water. So to think about it, larger rice grain, more flavor, more intensity, less water absorbent. So we can spend a little bit more time not have to care for it quite so much. A little less labor is going to go into that. Where if we have a rice grain milled down to 50% or less, we have a lot less flavor, more delicate, more elegant texture, and it's very absorbent. So we have to be very careful. It's much more labor intensive, timing down to the second on how long we are soaking the rice. Now that we have some moisture within the rice, we need to get the exterior shell more malleable. And the easiest way to get the shell to be malleable is to steam the rice. We can steam the rice one of two ways. This traditional method, which is you're going to load it yourself in layers. You'll have this cloth down, lay a layer of rice, put another cloth down, another layer of rice, another cloth down, another layer of rice until you get to the desired height inside of that steaming basket. This traditional method takes roughly an hour. The second method is by a continuous steaming machine, which will do all the steps for you. You just load the rice into one side. And as you can see here, this is a fully steamed set of rice. The machine here takes around 30 to 40 minutes. So it's quite a bit quicker. This will be a little, of course, more time consuming. However, you can control the steam a little bit better and how it accesses and penetrates the rice, where the steaming machine has a little bit less control on the manual side, but it offsets the labor and the time that takes to fill up the steaming basket. So here's what the rice grain looks like before it goes through the steaming process. You can see here in the middle of the rice grains, there's this white center that's a little bit more opaque than the rest of the grain. That is the shinpaku. So we have unsteamed rice. This is freshly polished unsteamed rice here. And then our fresh steamed rice kind of looks like sticky rice when you get sticky rice from a Thai restaurant. So once we've steamed our rice, we need to let the rice cool. 1/3 of the batch is going to go into another process. 2/3 of the batch will go straight to being used for fermentation itself. So don't worry about the other 2/3. That 1/3 is what we're really going to focus on next to be able to make our second main ingredient in sake, which is koji. So our first main ingredient is rice. Our second main ingredient is koji. So koji is steamed rice that has the sugar, or has the starch inside of the grain converted into sugar. This process will take about 2 days. Basically, it's going to be the morning of the third day when the rice has had all of the starch converted into sugar. And this is going to take place in a very special room, which you can see right here. And it's called a Koji muro. This Koji muro is basically going to start like a steam room and it's going to finish like a sauna. And so once we have that 1/3 of the steamed rice batch cooled, we're going to bring it into this room. This room has these beds that are very long, flat beds. And we are going to spread the rice out over the bed in a very, very thin layer. The thin layer and a very even layer on top of that is very important because we are going to go through and sprinkle mold over the top of the rice. This mold is known as Koji kin, and it's a good mold, not a bad mold. It actually tastes very, very sweet and has a basically reminiscent of roasted chestnuts. If you've had roasted chestnuts before or smelled roasted chestnuts, it's a delicious smell that happens in this room. So we're going to lay the rice out on a thin layer. We're going to take basically what looks like a powdered sugar shaker, and we are going to shake over the top of that thin layer the mold spores that are going to basically attach themselves to the rice grain. We want to make sure that the room inside is nice and humid and nice and warm to encourage the growth of this mold. So mold needs moisture to be able to grow, and the heat is going to help it as well. So Once we have spread the mold out over the entire grain of or bed of rice, we're going to go through and we're going to massage the rice grains to make sure the mold gets over all of the rice. Then we're going to take a cloth and we're going to wrap up the rice into kind of like a ball, and we're going to let it sit for about 12 hours. The purpose of this 12 hours is to let the moisture in the room encourage and promote the growth of the mold. As the mold begins to grow, it's going to release an enzyme that will convert the starch in the center of the grain into sugar. And so once we have 12 hours of mold growth, we're going to lay the rice back out. We're going to unwrap it and go through and massage it again. Basically, we're going to break up all of the clumps where the mold could be sticking to make sure we still have consistent growth throughout the whole grain of rice. And then we're going to wrap it up again and let the mold continue to do its job. The next day, we'll come back, we'll open up the cloth again, and we're going to now start to suck out the moisture in the room and we'll still keep the room nice and warm, but it's going to make the mold have to search for moisture. And the purpose of soaking that rice grain and steaming that rice grain is to have moisture within the rice grain. So what happens is that mold is going to start burying itself into the center of the rice grain to be able to find moisture, to still be able to grow. What happens is the starch is in the middle of that center rice grain. So as the mold starts to bury into the center of the grain, it finds the starch. The enzymes that the mold produces starts to convert that starch into sugar. And the very next day, the morning of the third day, this delicious smell is throughout the entire room of roasted chestnuts. And the rice goes from looking, this is our freshly polished rice, to our steamed rice, to now this is Koji. It is steamed rice that has had the starch within converted into sugar. So it's basically very sweet rice. When you taste it, it kind of tastes like it's got powdered sugar on the outside of it. And it actually even looks like it. You have this white fuzzy exterior coating, which is on the rice that actually goes all the way into the center of the rice as well. And this is where the sugar comes from. So we have our rice ready. Now we have our Koji ready. The next important ingredient is water. So sake itself is about 80% water. There's 20 times more water used in the production of sake than there is in the final product. So the quality of water that we use for sake production is very important. We can't have great sake without great quality water. You could use hard water or you could use soft water. It is up to you as a brewer. The harder the water, the more robust, the more structured the style will be. The softer the water, the more delicate, light, finessed the sake is going to be. Japan in general is almost 100% soft water. There's just a couple little pockets throughout Japan that are very unique and have hard water. So in general, sake that comes from Japan is typically lighter and more delicate than sake made in the rest of the world, where, especially in the US, where hard water is where we are a little bit more known for. The water can come from multiple different sources, such as rivers, shrines. Shrine water is highly coveted. So there are some very ancient breweries that have been around since like the 14, 15, 1600s even, that are still in existence, that purposely built their brewery next to a shrine to be able to use the shrine water. Spring water is very common. And then in the north, where it's very snowy and we have much higher elevation in Japan, we use snow melt. And so there's so much snow, specifically in Niigata, there's so much snow that they just melt the snow and they use that for sake production as well, which seems a little crazy, but it makes really delicious, very finessed styles of sake. And our last ingredient, this ingredient is the ingredient that is going to give us alcohol. So yeast is very similar to beer yeast or wine yeast. It's still Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the type of yeast that is used for wine and beer production. However, the yeast has been bred to be more alcohol tolerant. So instead of stopping fermentation in wine or beer production at maybe, if you're lucky, 15 or 16% alcohol, this yeast can keep going until we get to 20, even 22% alcohol. 22% alcohol is the highest permitted alcohol for sake to be called sake. So you won't ever see sake higher than that because legally it's not allowed to be higher than that. So you can use natural yeast that you find in your brewery. You can create your own specific yeast proprietary to your brewery, or what the majority of people do are they buy these 10 milliliter vials from the Brewing Society of Japan. And each of these vials has a different type of yeast. Some yeasts are known for creating very floral styles of sake. Some yeasts are known to giving herbaceous flavor. Some yeasts are known for giving strawberry, melon flavors, or some are apple and pear flavors. Some do better in cold. Some do better with heat. Some are bred to be even higher alcohol tolerant. There's all these different variables that you can choose in the yeast that you use for your production. Some people use one yeast specifically, or some actually blend yeasts together to capitalize on each of their attributes. So we've got all 4 of our ingredients basically broken down. Do you have any questions about water, yeast, koji, or rice before we move into how sake is made? All right, it looks like we are good. So how sake is made. To begin the process of sake fermentation, we have to create what is known as a starter. And this is really similar to bread production. If you've ever made bread before, you have to create a starter to be able to have a yeast population that is strong enough to carry out the fermentation. So what we're going to do over the course of 4 days, we will have 3 separate ingredients. On the first day, we will add all 4 main ingredients: rice, which is steamed rice, water, koji, and yeast. The yeast will only be added on the very first day. There is no more yeast additions for the rest of the production of the starter. So what happens on the first day, we have these 4 ingredients added, and then we are going to let the batch just sit for a day. The second day is known as odori, which means to dance. And this is the time that the yeast is going to have to basically absorb as many nutrients as it can and start to multiply and create a healthy population of yeast. The nutrients come from the koji as well as from the steamed rice. So after the second day, we will do a second addition. That addition is going to be the 3 main ingredients without the yeast addition. So we'll add more water, more steamed rice, and more koji. Once these 3 ingredients are added, the yeast now has more nutrients to multiply and to create a stronger population of itself. On the 4th day, we will add our last addition of water, steamed rice, and koji. And now we let the yeast consume as many nutrients as it can, multiply as much as it can, and have a very strong, healthy population of yeast to be able to carry out the fermentation. So we have a 4-day process, 3-step process to creating the main fermentation mash. This 3-step process is known as san dan jikomi. Fun fact for you, you probably don't need to know that, but fun fact, san dan jikomi is this process of adding 4 ingredients on the first day, 3 ingredients on the 3rd day, 3 more ingredients on the 4th day, this 4-day process to create our main fermentation mash. Once our main fermentation mash is created, then fermentation can begin. What's very, very unique about sake production, the first is that we are creating Koji. In beer production, there is a germ that produces the enzymes that create sugar from starch or convert starch into sugar. With rice, we polish away that germ. So the production of Koji is extremely important to be able to have that enzyme that will convert starch into sugar. So Koji is our very first, most important thing that makes sake unique compared to all other fermented beverages or just beverages in general. The next process is the fermentation process. We have steamed rice being added to the vat, and we have Koji in the vat. The Koji still has active enzymes within it that is going to find the starch in the steamed rice and convert any starch that they can find into sugar. At the same time, in this large vat that the enzymes are converting starch into sugar, yeast is going to convert any sugar that is in the vat into alcohol. So basically, they're constantly feeding each other. The enzymes will keep producing sugar, so the yeast can keep producing alcohol. And this process will take anywhere from about 21 to 40 days, depending on the style of sake that we are producing. The colder the temperature, the slower this production is going to be, because yeast thrive in heat. Mold and enzymes thrive in heat. So if we have the vat controlled to a cooler temperature, it's going to make each process go slower, which is going to make the fermentation longer, and it's going to create a very light, very delicate, more floral and fruity style of sake. If we have the fermentation basically let go, we have the temperature not controlled, we let the heat rise, a warm fermentation makes both processes become more vigorous. They're much faster. And the faster these processes go, the more nutrients that are going to be basically penetrating the flavor of the sake. So the more robust, the more intense, the more flavorful, the more extra flavors we're going to get, whether they be cereal type of flavors, lactic type of flavors, all sorts of different kind of flavors can come through. So cooler fermentation, longer process, lighter, delicate, softer style of sake, warmer fermentation, quicker process, more robust, more flavorful style of sake. Once the fermentation is finished, we have quite a few steps that we still have to go through before we can call the sake sake. The next step after fermentation is the optional addition of distilled alcohol. We do not have to add distilled alcohol to the vat. This is completely optional. And the purpose of adding distilled alcohol to the vat is not to increase the alcohol. We're not fortifying at this point because of steps that are going to happen down the road from now. What we're doing is we are basically preserving the work of the brewer. They just spent all of this time preparing each ingredient specifically, carrying out the fermentation to a T to make the sake taste the way it does. And the flavors and the aromas that are found in sake are more soluble in alcohol than they are in water. This alcohol can be made from any agricultural product. It has to be neutral and at high proof. However, because this is mainly produced in Japan and the largest agricultural product coming out of Japan is rice, this is typically a rice distilled beverage that is being added to the vat. What happens when we add this distilled alcohol, we are preserving the flavors and the aromas, so it's going to make the sake be more flavorful and more aromatic. But the most important thing that we are doing is we are going to preserve the shelf life of the sake. So if a sake has had distilled alcohol added to the vat, it will have a longer shelf life, unopened and opened. If they do not add distilled alcohol to the vat, the brewer will tell you by saying Junmai on the label. Junmai means pure, and no alcohol has been added to the vat. So Junmai sakes will have a shorter shelf life, unopened as well as opened. Next, we have basically a boozy rice porridge at this point. And at this point, the liquid inside of the vat is not considered sake. We cannot call it sake until we have pressed the solids away from the liquids. And this pressing can be done in 3 separate ways, or you can use all of these ways. It's very much up to the brewer. So the most labor intensive, the most time consuming, and the style that lets more oxygen impact the sake is the gravity method. What we're going to do is we're going to fill that rice porridge, that alcoholic rice porridge, into a cloth bag. The cloth bag is then going to be tied, and it's going to be hung on a pole over a tub. Only what freely comes out of the bag by gravity is used at this point. You will have still about 50% of the liquid remaining in the bag that gravity will no longer press. So what a lot of people do is that first batch that comes out freely by gravity will go into its own bottling and become a very unique, very special sake, maybe used for competition, or it could be their daigenjo, or something special that they're producing at the brewery. Next is the process that is done with a traditional press. This traditional press is known as a fune, and you're going to lay the cloth bags out on their side, as this gentleman is doing right now. You can kind of see the bags laying on their side here. You're going to lay the cloth bags on the side. Once he has the whole vat filled, he's going to hop out, and this top lever here is going to slowly come down and slowly press on the bags. This is very light, very delicate, and this process is going to take about 2 days. So you can either put a fresh bag inside of these, and you'll have about 80% of the liquid pressed out of the bags with this method. Or you could take the bags that were hanging from the gravity press and put them into the fune, press them to get more liquid out of the bags, and create another sake. The third method of pressing is by machine. This machine is known as a yabuta, and the yabuta will press, as you can see, this lever presses against, and it'll press the bags until they're completely flat. This will make sure all liquid is completely pressed out of the bags, and it will create basically sheets of alcoholic rice that is pressed together in these hard sheets. This machine can be altered to give the same amount of force as a fune, or altered to give almost the same type of force as a gravity press. So some people will only use the yabuta and then just alter the pressure of the machine to duplicate these traditional ways of pressing. Then some people have all 3 presses within the brewery, and they will produce different sake from each press. It is completely up to the brewer, but to be able to be called sake, we have to press the liquid away from the solids. Ooh. The next options, or the next steps, are basically optional. There are quite a few different steps once you have pressed the sake to be able to make the sake taste or not taste differently. The first step after pressing is filtration. And if you're familiar with vodka, we hear a lot of times there's carbon filtered vodka. The carbon is going to pull the colors out of it to make it a very clear, colorless style of sake. We typically have, I would say 99% of all sake is carbon filtered. This is to make sure that any oxygen exposure that happened will not show through in the final product because it's going to remove any color that could have occurred in the production method. If the brewer does not carbon filter their sake, they will put the word muroka on the label. Muroka means non-carbon filtered. The next step is the addition of water. Again, probably about 99% of all sake has the addition of water. And the reason why they did this or began doing this is because the volume wasn't what was taxed by the government. The alcohol percentage is what was taxed by the government. So a lot of times we would dilute the sake batch by adding water, and this is very high quality water, like we're using for the whole production of brewing, to bring down the alcohol to a more tolerant level for everyone to consume. So once the sake batch is finished with fermentation, we're at about 20% alcohol. Ideally, anywhere between 15 and 17% alcohol is what is preferred for consumers to consume alcohol. The alcohol will be balanced at 15 to 17%. Over 17, you can typically feel the impact of the alcohol quite a bit more. And so if a brewer decides not to add water to the final batch, they will call the sake genshu. Genshu means cask strength or undiluted. No water has been added to the batch. The next step is pasteurization. Pasteurization is completely optional. However, about 95% of all sake is pasteurized. The purpose of pasteurizing the sake is to preserve the shelf life of the sake, to kill any active yeasts, enzymes, anything, bacteria that could have gotten inside of the vat. If we do not pasteurize the sake, they still have active enzymes, active bacteria inside of the bottle, and it creates a very, very short shelf life. Because the bacteria, if it overwhelms the sake, it will go bad. And so in general, if the sake is unpasteurized, they will put the word nama on the label, meaning the sake has not been pasteurized. And this sake should be treated like milk, and it's only good for a couple weeks, and it should always be kept in the refrigerator. So pasteurized sake should be kept in the refrigerator, but doesn't have to be. Cool temperatures are very much preferred though, and has a longer shelf life. Nama is unpasteurized. Basically treat it like milk. It is good within a couple weeks and should always be kept in the refrigerator. The next optional step is storage. Some brewers store their sake for 6 months or so before they release it to the public, just to let the sake harmonize with itself and become one. Sake can taste a little rough right after it's produced. So a lot of times it's going to sit 6 months, maybe even up to a year, so it can really harmonize, balance out, and show properly. Then the brewer will release it to be consumed. If the brewer intentionally ages the sake at the brewery, this is typically going to be 2 years or more, they can call their sake koshu. Now, the time that they age the sake is not dictated by law, but typically it's going to be over 2 years. And this isn't, I left my sake in the closet for 2 years, yay, I have koshu now. This is intentionally aged sake at the brewery. and released after the aging regimen that the brewer decides to be called koshu. So on the tip, like a traditional brewery, on the first day of October, which is International Sake Day, 1st of October is basically the day that sake brewing begins. They're going to put up, whoa, my mouse is freaking out. They're going to put up this cedar ball. The cedar ball on the 1st of October will be green because it is a fresh cedar ball. I took this picture in February, so it's quite brown in this picture. But once it turns brown, you know that sake is being produced at the brewery. When sake is ready to be consumed, they will replace this ball with a fresh cedar ball. It's called a sugidama. They will replace the sugidama with a fresh cedar ball, and it will indicate sake is ready, come drink. So those are the steps in a very simplified manner on how sake is created. Any questions before we talk about the styles of sake? Perfect. So the styles of sake, this is a oversimplified chart that is easy to imprint into your memory on how to remember the styles of sake that are produced. So futsushu is table sake. There basically are no laws that they have to follow. There's no rice polishing requirement. They can put additives into it if they so choose. And in general, futsushu is the least quality sake that the brewery is making. Does that mean it tastes bad? Not necessarily. There's a lot of very delicious futsushu. If you haven't been to Japan, one great thing about when you go there is they have vending machines throughout basically the whole city. And all the vending machines have sake in the vending machine. It's the coolest thing ever. I just geeked out the whole time I was in Japan. And typically, the sake that you are going to see in the vending machine is going to be futsushu. So the next quality level is going to be junmai if no alcohol has been added to the vat, or hanjozo if alcohol has been added to the vat. Junmai used to have a polishing requirement. The 3 largest breweries in Japan, which are Hakutsuru, Gekkeikan, and Hakkaisan, basically petitioned the government and said, if I'm only using rice, water, koji, and yeast, it is the purest form of sake. I should be able to call my junmai junmai without polishing it down to a 70% remaining of the grain. I want to polish it to 80% so I can have a higher volume of production, which thus means I'm going to give you more taxes to the government. And the government said, okay, sure, we'll take away the polishing requirement. I believe this was in 2011. They took away the polishing requirement. Don't quote me on that. It could be a different year. And so now junmai does not have a polishing requirement anymore. It just means there's no alcohol added. There's no additives added. It's only rice, water, koji, and yeast used to produce the sake itself. Hanjozo has to be milled to at least 70% of the grain remaining, and it has alcohol added. Now, sometimes on a sake label, you will see this funny word, which is tokubetsu, on the label. Tokubetsu can be on a label of junmai or on a label of hanjozo. It won't show up on any of the other styles, just for these 2. And tokubetsu means something special. The something special is not dictated by law. It can be anything that the brewer does to this specific batch that is special from the other batches. But typically, it's going to mean that the rice was milled down to a lower percentage than was required, or they're using a very specific rice grain that is unique to sake production. Next is junmai genjo and genjo. If it says Junmai on the label, no alcohol was added. If it doesn't say Junmai, then alcohol was added, and the rice grain has to be milled to at least 60% of the grain remaining. Lastly is Junmai Daigenjo, or just Daigenjo if alcohol was added. And the milling requirement is 50% or less for this style of sake. As we go down the pyramid, we are starting with Futsushu, which is rich and savory and robust and full-bodied. Moving down to Daigenjo, which is light and delicate and floral and fruity and light-bodied, or light to medium-bodied, depending on the producer. Now, this is the basic styles of sake. The next slide is going to be specialty sakes. Specialty sakes can apply to any of these styles. They don't have to have a specific style for the special sake. It can be a futsushu or it can be a daigenjo. It's really up to the brewer. So the next slide is our common specialty sakes. There are a lot more than this, but these are the most common ones that you are going to see in a Japanese restaurant or walking through a sake retail shop. So we talked about this one, nama. Nama, if on the label, means the sake is unpasteurized. These sakes are very fresh, very vibrant, uniquely aromatic. To me, I always get like a cotton candy and a cantaloupe juice note to it. They're very fresh and very vibrant. Because it isn't pasteurized, so we're not raising the heat of the batch, we are keeping it cooled the entire time. There are active microorganisms in the bottle, which means that nama needs to be treated like milk, stored at chilled temperatures in the refrigerator and consumed within a couple weeks. Next is nigori. So a lot of times you will hear nigori means unfiltered sake, but sake has to be filtered. So this is the easiest way to remember this is either roughly filtered sake or cloudy sake. So what happens for nigori sake production is typically when they filter the sake, they are going to filter it through a coarse mesh. That coarse mesh is going to let some solids come through, creating that white or cloudy color that you see for nigori sake. Because you have those solids coming through, you will have more sweetness in the final product. So in general, nigori sake is going to be anywhere from maybe medium dry to sweet in flavor. And they are going to have that cloudy, milky color to the batch. It is important to shake the bottle really, really well before you pour nigori sake, so you have the sediment mix through and be poured evenly through every single glass that you pour. Because you still have the solids in contact, some of the solids, not all of them, the solids in contact with the liquid, there is a shorter shelf life for nigori. So nigori should be kept at chilled temperatures, and it should be consumed within a year. Koshu, we mentioned, it's aged sake, intentionally aged sake at the brewery, not I just left my sake in the closet for 2 years and voila, I have koshu. Not quite the same thing. And this is typically aged at the brewery for a minimum of 2 years. However, I've tasted sake that was brewed all the way back to 1971. You could have it even longer than that. Koshu gets quite unique in the flavor. It almost reminds me, if you are familiar with the wine side of the world, it reminds me a lot of Rhone. You get these savory, meaty, briny, olivey, almondy, sea spray kind of flavors that end up showing through in the sake. It's very unique and quite delicious in my opinion. The next style of sake, specialty style of sake, is sparkling sake. And this is all the rage right now. So sparkling sake is like the Moscato of sake. It is going to be very sweet and can be made basically the same way that sparkling wine is made. It can be made in the traditional method where the second fermentation happens in the bottle. It can be made in the tank method where the second fermentation happens in a tank, or you can soda stream style it. Please don't put your sake in a soda stream. It doesn't work out nicely. They sent out actual like warnings back when soda stream came out saying don't put alcohol into it, only use it for water. But basically that is the method where you're just injecting CO2 into the sake. I don't know very many sakes that are produced this way. This is a not great quality method of making sake. However, the tank method or the bottle method for sake production both makes good to high quality styles of sake. It's really up to the brewer on how that they prefer to produce it. Typically, sparkling sake is going to be lower in alcohol, around 5, maybe 10% alcohol. And again, it's going to be on the sweeter side. The last and maybe the least common of the specialty sakes that you're going to see from this list is taro sake. Taro is cedar in Japanese, and the sake will be aged in taro vats, which are Japanese cedar vats. Japanese cedar is very, very pungent and very flavorful. So typically the longest amount of time the sake is going to spend in contact with these vats is 2 weeks. But it's not required by law how little or long you let the sake stay in contact with the vat. It just has to actually touch the vat to be called taro sake. In the wine world, you can use a lot of oak alternatives. In the sake world, you cannot use taro alternatives. You can only use a cedar vat for taro sake production. So any questions on specialty sake before, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Before we go into the service and storage breakdown of sake. Perfect. All right, so service and storage. The golden rule for sake service is you never pour yourself. You should only pour for others and let others pour for yourself. In general, these are the traditional service vessels that you are going to see in traditional restaurants that use these, or for traditional service in general. The most common is this ochoko, which is a small cup that is roughly 60 milliliters in size. They're very, very small. This is only a few ounces. And the purpose of these small, tiny cups is that you are paying attention to the people at your table. You're watching their cup and making sure that you're keeping their cup full. It's just a way that the Japanese culture makes sure that you are giving each other the due attention and the proper amount of just watching everyone and taking care of each other. The second option, this is typically done for traditional Japanese restaurants that are serving sake by the glass. They're going to use a large ceramic cup called a guinomi. This is typically around 120 milliliters in size, so we're looking at 5-6-ish ounces. And a typical by the glass pour for sake will be similar to a typical by the glass wine pour, which will be anywhere between 4 and 6 ounces, but 6 ounces is going to probably be the most common, or even 5 ounces would be very common. Sometimes you'll see these white ochokos that have a bullseye that is painted in blue on the bottom of the cup. This is called a kikichoko and used for judging sake because the blue will show if there's any coloring issues in the sake. Again, filtration is very common because we want our sake to be clear and colorless. The sakazuki is a ceremonial cup, which is the same size as an ochoko, but you can see it's got a very wide mouth that almost looks like a saucer. I don't see these very often. It's typically just used for ceremonial purposes. The next is a masu. So what happens is a masu is used for pour over service. You're typically going to put a footed cup or a shot glass into the masu. You're going to pour the sake into the shot glass and pour it over so it fills up the masu to about 3/4 of the way up the box. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to drink out of the footed cup or the shot glass, then pour the masu into the glass, and then still drink out of the glass. My silly self thought I should drink out of the box. Drinking out of a square, not so easy, and it tends to bring sake onto your shirt rather than into your mouth. So trust me on that one, I've made the mistake. Don't try to drink out of the box. Pour the box into the glass and then pour the glass into your mouth. The purpose of this pour over service is basically giving homage to the Japanese culture. The Japanese culture is all about hospitality, giving, caring, generosity. And the purpose of pouring over the glass is to show that they are very thankful for you to be in their establishment, for choosing to taste with them, to eat with them, to dine with them, whatever you are doing, and just an extra bit of generosity, giving you a little extra, just an extra thank you. So again, the footed cup is commonly used if they don't want to use the ceramic vessels in the restaurant. The chirori is a metal ochoko, which is often used for hot sake service to keep the sake hot. Granted, it is metal and it kind of burns your fingers when you go to use it. So this is, again, not something you'll see very often. Ceramic actually keeps the sake warm for quite some time, so ceramic is a lot more commonly seen. And then since I just mentioned hot sake service, the easiest way to heat your sake is by pouring it into a tokuri. So a tokuri is a carafe, a ceramic carafe, that is typically the size of a half bottle of sake. This is going to be around 300 milliliters or so. You'll pour the sake into the tokuri. You'll place the tokuri into a hot water bath for a couple minutes, and voila, you have hot sake service. So when it comes to service, there are a lot of temperatures that you can serve your sake at. The two in blue are the most common. So suzu-hie, which means cool or reminiscent of a cool breeze, is the common service temperature for all styles of sake. This is going to be between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, or for anyone not using the US system, 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Cold sake, the best sake served cold is daigenjo, genjo, nama, and sparkling sake. However, again, all sake can be served chilled. Atsu-kan service is hot sake service, and this is typically used in the winter time to help warm us up. Just like you drink iced tea in the summer, you drink hot tea in the winter. Very similar for sake service in Japan. Atsu-kan service means hot enough to warm the body and soul, and is served between 120, 130 degrees Fahrenheit or 50 to 55 degrees Celsius. Now, it is not recommended that all sake can be heated. You can heat any sake with the exception of sparkling sake. That would be kind of weird to heat sparkling sake. I guess you could do it if the guest wants it, do whatever they want. But the traditional best sakes to use for heated sake service or atsu-kan service would be hanjozo, junmai, and then two we didn't speak of that we'll dive more into in Sake 201 is kimoto and yamahai. And these are the two most traditional methods of making sake. And they're very flavorful, very robust, very savory, umami ridden types of sakes. So basically, the easiest thing to remember is the lighter, more delicate styles of sake, better to be served chilled. The fuller bodied, more flavorful styles of sake are okay to be served heated. When it comes to storage, sake should be treated like white wine. Ideally, you want to keep all sake in the refrigerator. If you can't, because a lot of places, refrigeration is not the easiest thing to come by, ideally just keep it in a cool location rather than out like on a regular shelf in the middle of your store. Try to keep it in a cooler location. It is best to store sake away from harsh lighting. Most sake is in either a green or a brown bottle, which help to block the light waves. This is very similar if you know anything about beer storage, very similar to beer storage. Light shock can happen. And so the more you keep the sake away from harsh lighting, the better it is for the overall production of the sake itself, or condition of the sake itself. Now, sake is not like wine in the fact that we do not keep it on its side unless it has a cork. Some sakes have a cork, but not many of them. Most of them have the metal or the glass closure on top. And so when you have a bottle on its side, there's more oxygen touching more sake. And we really want to keep as much oxygen away from sake as possible. That's why we have the metal cap or the glass cap closures. So when you keep sake upright, you only have that very top of the sake that's in the neck of the bottle in contact with the oxygen. So as a summation, sake should be stored upright in a cool, ideally refrigerated condition away from harsh lighting to prevent light shock. Any questions about sake? So this is sake 101. We will have sake 201 coming up on the 28th of August, also at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And we will dive deeper into each of the ingredients. But the most important thing we're going to dive deeper into is the fermentation. So I gave you just the very, very basics of fermentation. Fermentation is quite a bit more intense than that, but this is sake 101. I don't want to overwhelm you. I want you to understand the basics before we build upon those. And then depending on how participation goes for sake 101 and sake 201, we will start the breakout sessions, the rice, the koji, the water, all the different breakout sessions of the process of making sake. So just to, if I can find my mouse, there we go. Just to remind you, we have a sake resources page on the website. If you want to get a jump start on what is going to be in sake 201, so you can be prepared and ready with questions, sake 201, there's a study guide right here that you can click on. This is available to all members, which is free. All you have to do is to create a login and email and password, and voila, you are a member. It is all free. And we have a ton of information here all about sake 201. We will cover that again on August 28th. And then all of these top tiles are free for all members. So this breaks more into storage and service, the laws, into tasting, regionality, brands, and more education. If you'd like to get certifications, this is a great tile to click because it will talk about all of the different sake certifications that are found throughout and a little brief detail about them. Also great books about sake, great organizations for extra study resources, basically. And then if you totally geek out on sake and you want to know more than 101 and 201, then all industry plan members, which is $20 a month, will have access to these master level deep dives into each of these components of sake production. Now, these are not for the faint of heart. They are master level deep dives that really go into all of these aspects of sake. As you have already seen, because you're in today's class, there are sake classes available with codes that will lessen the price of the class if you so need the extra help right now during these super crazy times. Sake 101, of course, is today. Sake 201 is at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Saturday, August 28th. And then we have all about rice, all about Koji, all about fermentation and regionality coming soon. There are not dates done for that yet because I have a few exams myself coming up that need a little bit of my focus before I start putting together these deep dive presentations. So back to the presentation itself. Any questions that anyone has before we say goodbye to each other and you're off to enjoy your Saturday? As a reminder, this class was recorded, so this will be up live on the website where you saw the Sake 101 class picture. There will be a link there once the class has been uploaded, and you can go back and review this class if you so choose. Looks like we are good on all of the questions, just lots of thank yous coming in. So thank you all so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you understand sake a little bit more now, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I will see you for Sake 201 on August 28th at 11 a.m. Pacific. Have a great one.